Hi folks, this is Kiliii Yuyan from Seawolf Kayak. I wanted to talk today a little bit about choosing the right type of wood to make a good solid Greenland paddle or to make a traditional kayak frame. This is a nice piece of wood. You can see with the grain in the right orientation, it's quite strong. Another piece of wood that's also cut very similar, same thickness. You can see as I start to get into the same difference right there, just because the grain was off a little bit, it's much weaker.
Alright, the first thing to do is we're going to look at two pieces of wood that are the same dimensions and the same species of wood. These are both cedar, but you can also see that one of them is light color and the other one is a dark color, and that one of them has a very clear flaw in it. The difference between these two types of wood is primarily that one of them is the sapwood of a cedar tree, one of them is the heartwood. The sapwood is marginally stronger, so don't let the color fool you. It's not such a big deal. What does matter, though, is this flaw right here. All right, now you can see we've got two different pieces of wood right here, and both of these are pieces of wood along the edge. So right now, this surface right here is what we call the face of a piece of wood, and this is what we call the edge of a piece of wood. The face is the wider section. Usually when you get a board, the face is the big wide section. So on a 2x4 it's the 4-inch dimension, whereas on the 2-inch dimension right here is the edge. So with that, when you look on here, you can see that along the edge what we've got are a bunch of parallel lines running from one end all the way down to the other end. These parallel lines are the grain of the wood. The grain is essentially a series of growth rings. It's very possible that a piece of wood can be very strong, but you just, even if you can't see the grain clearly, but we don't know that. There's no way to know that from the surface other than to look at the grain. So likewise, you can see that a piece of wood can be curved, like this one, and still have the grain running along like this. Back in the day when we made traditional kayaks using driftwood, we'd always be looking for pieces of wood, say a tree root or a piece where a tree grew out of the ground or it was a twisted branch or something, and then the grain would naturally grow like this in this curved direction. So you can see it doesn't really matter. I don't care, again, what's on the face. It can be all squirrely like this. It can be feathery and strange. As long as the grain along the edge has nice straight parallel lines and it runs the entire length of the board. Okay, so this is a really short piece of wood right here. This is just an example piece. Right now, if you look at the paddle and this piece of wood right here, this paddle is oriented like this. So the paddle actually comes out of this piece of wood in that orientation, right on top like this. So when we look at the edge grain, we're actually looking at it like this. The paddle's going to be resting alongside, and when we take a look up close, you can see that you've got a series of parallel lines running along one edge like that. When you really think about it, a paddle needs to be strong in this dimension and not in this dimension, because there gets very little stress in this direction, but it gets far more stress in this direction. So what we've been talking about so far, it applies to both paddles and to kayak longitudinal wood. So that'll be the pieces like the gunnels, and your keels and stringers, as well as your deck beams.
Okay guys, I'm going to take a look at some wood here. We're going to pick out what pieces we want. I'm going to look for flaws. So let's take a quick look at what kinds of flaws you might have in your wood. And then we're going to choose a nice piece for a paddle. The same stuff applies when you're looking at gunnels with longitudinals of a kayak. So when you look at this piece here, you can see that there's the grain is running along the edge, and it's nice and straight. But if you look at it over a long distance, you can see that the grain is also going from one side of the board to the other side of the board, and it's basically running off. You're not looking for grain that does that. You want grain to stay parallel for the entire length of the board, from one side here all the way down to here, and for it to not run off. Alright, so a couple other things let's take a look at. Some of the flaws in your wood that you can have include pieces being crushed. So a lot of times when they load up the wood, you can see that forklifts or straps will crush the wood, and this basically means that you're going to lose this entire piece from the top all the way to the bottom because it has to be cut in a long strip. Another thing that's really obvious is you want to avoid really big knots like this, of course, because again it means that this whole piece is unuseful. But you also want to avoid smaller knots as well. A good example of a smaller knot would be something like this. This is a pretty small knot, and also up here you can see this is an even smaller knot. You don't have to worry about this one if that's all you can get. If you can't find a piece without these kinds of tiny pin knots, then you can go ahead and use it. But you want to avoid something even as big as this, especially if you see it come out of somewhere else on the board. Another thing you can see is that sometimes we have this area where there's something called curved grain. This curved grain is an area where the grain swoops like this. Usually if you see it on the face, it means you're going to see it along the edge as well. This swoop like this, in this case, this is okay because it's a very minor little bit of swoop, but a lot of times you'll see it dip really dramatically. If you get a dramatic dip like that, you would definitely not take this piece. So let's take a look at a piece of grain that's really nice and clean and beautiful. You can see right here, we've got lines here that are parallel, and they run straight up and down for the entire length. These parallel lines basically, the straight and parallel lines and parallel grain mean that this board is strong from the beginning to the end, and this is the only way that you can tell without cutting into the wood.